everyone, this is Lomi, and today I'll show you how I begin pants patterns for my dolls. I was originally going to do this with Rylan to complete an outfit I'm working on for quarter scale boys, but he's so small it would have been hard to show, so I'm using Pharrell instead. We begin with measurements. I begin with the overall length measurement. From the point on the waist I want these pants to sit, down to the doll's ankle. When choosing the waistline, it can be the natural waist or down lower on the hips, whichever you prefer. I think the natural waist would be too high, so her pants will come up to the top edge of her undies. I measure around the knee. I considered measuring the ankle, but I decided not to make these pants fitted in the ankle, so I won't need that this time. I measure around the waist where I want these pants to sit. And I measure the hip around the fullest part of the doll's bottom. I took my measurements in inches at first, but later converted some of them to centimeters. I'll explain why, but the next measurement needed is the hip depth, which is from the waistline I picked down to where the fullest part of the hip is. Then I measure down from the chosen waistline to the knee to find the knee depth. Last of all, I find the seat depth by sitting the doll up and measuring from the surface she's sitting on to the chosen waistline. With all the measurements taken, now I get to do some math. The hip and knee measurements need to be divided by 2. I don't always use half the waist measurement when drafting, but I always write it down just in case I need it for something later. The hip measurement and waist measurement also need to be divided by 4. 1/4 of the hip measurement is used to find the front and back extension calculations. The front extension is 15% of 1/4 the hip measurement. The back extension is 45% of 1/4 the hip measurement, or 3 times the front extension calculation. After I find these calculations, I leave my length measurements, the depths, in inches, but I convert my calculations to centimeters. I'll be marking the depths using my yardstick at first, which only has inches on it. Using centimeters for the horizontal measurements lets me be more accurate, so when I have to make stuff long, I use inches, and short, I use centimeters. If you have a meter stick or a yardstick that happens to also have centimeters on it, you probably won't need to bounce back and forth like I do, which honestly would probably be easier. Now I begin the drafting process. Somewhere in the middle of the paper, I draw a line that will become the center line of the drafting grid. Since my yardstick is already laying here, I go ahead and mark the total length, knee depth, seat depth, and the hip depth at their respective measurements. This will eventually divide the grid into sections. This is sort of how you do a sloper, but I begin my customization with the very first block, so I'll explain a bit of that too. To determine the width of the grid, I create a top line using the 1/2 hip circumference, with this center line right in the middle. For me, that means 14.3 centimeters total, so 7.15 centimeters on either side of that center line. The same measurement gets marked on the bottom to create the bottom of the grid, and then I connect the top and bottom corners with a straight line. This gives me a long box divided into 2 sections, one for the pattern front and one for the back. While I'm here, I want to take a second to mention that there will not be any videos for a few weeks because I'm tackling some huge projects that'll take me a long time to film and prepare, and I won't have any extra time to do videos while I'm making that happen. I plan to take around a month to finish these huge ideas, and hopefully I'll go back to pretty regular updates after that. In the meantime, I'll be posting photos and a few project updates to Instagram, so I won't be falling off the face of the earth. I'm super excited for the things I'll be doing, so I can't wait to share. To divide these rectangles into the rest of the sections, the new sides of the box also need to be marked with the hip depth, seat depth, and knee depth. Once they're marked and double-checked, I can connect the markings to create 4 smaller sections on the big rectangles that will become our pattern. Now begins the hard part, and why I've put off covering this subject for so long. In pattern making, there are a lot of markings and instructions that come from standard sizing, which pattern making books and guides will provide. Unfortunately, according to my sewing instructor, there's no magic formula for figuring out how to make these work for non-standard sizes. That means every time you draft a pattern for a doll, you need to use the doll's individual measurements to find their scale proportional to standard human pattern sizing, which can vary even by what country you're in. Then you'll have to divide these standard measurements by your doll's scale, be it 1/3, 1/4, or something else. I'm lucky enough that my doll is a typical 1/3 scale this time, so all I have to do is divide the human standard measurements for this step by 3, and then work with that tiny number I get, 8.5 millimeters. This measurement is used to start the front, measuring down from the top corner and outer edge, then inward along the top line, creating a sort of little square. The dot I place where the corner of this square would be, that's where we begin the pattern. I align the edge of my ruler at an angle, crossing from this first dot to the top of the center line. Beginning at that dot, I mark the 1/4 waist measurement. The center line will be the back edge of the pattern, which allows us to expand across the outside line as necessary later on. From the end of the waist measurement, I angle the ruler down to the center line at the hip depth line. The angled line I draw here will become the outer curve of the hip. It can be rounded later if you prefer. Next, for the knee, I move to the outer edge of the pattern and mark 1/2 the knee measurement. Why from the outside edge? Because from that point, I angle up to the seat depth line on the center line, and the angled line I draw here becomes the rest of that curvy outer leg. From here you can draw the lower leg depending on the shape you want. You can mark the ankle measurement on the bottom line to make it a skinny fit, or you can flare outward for boot cut pants or bell bottoms. I just want these pants to have a straight leg, so I mark the knee measurement on the bottom as well, and connect that to the knee measurement on the knee depth line for a straight lower leg. Now it's time for me to draw the crotch. To do this, I extend the line out from the seat depth line, breaking past the front edge of the pattern. This uses the calculation I found before, which was 15% of 1/4 the hip measurement. Here is another place you'd typically use a standard measurement. You'd also normally use a protractor to find a 45-degree angle here, but I don't even own one of those, so here's how I do it. I mark that 15% measurement going up the front from the seat depth line too, then connect that to the extension to create a triangle. I can measure and mark halfway down this triangle's long line to split it evenly in half, giving me the angle I need. Instead of using a standard measurement for this line though, I've found that drawing a curve that falls at roughly 2/3 the length of that diagonal line works really well for the front. The curve stops at the line of the front edge, and from there I draw an angled line up to the first dot we drew for the waist. The front point of the extended crotch can now be connected to the knee depth line, and the basic front piece is now complete. Next, I begin the back piece. I like to start this by extending the crotch using the calculation that's 45% of the 1/4 hip measurement, otherwise I tend to forget which side is supposed to be which, and I mess things up. The actual drawing process starts like the front pattern, marking that 8.5 millimeter standard sizing measurement on the top line. Like with the front pattern piece, this begins in that outer corner, but instead of my little square being inset, it's actually going to go up. The same calculation up from the top edge. From here, I angle down. Might be more visible if I turn my ruler. Angle down from this point to the center line, and from this starting point, I mark the 1/4 waist measurement. Similar to the front, I measure down from this point to the hip depth mark on the center line and draw my angled line there. Once again, this can be rounded out later if so desired. The back has another tricky bit to it in that you're supposed to shift the leg over so the angle from the crotch to the knee isn't super sharp. For humans, the standard is, I believe, something like 1 inch to 1.5 inches, depending on how wide the hip measurement is, but again, this can vary from country to country and also from sewing guide to sewing guide. As a result, I like to not follow any rules here and just eyeball it based on what looks good and not too steep. The bottom cuff gets shifted over the same way. Likewise, some guides will say at this point that another standard measurement should apply to moving the outer edge in just a little instead of using the knee measurement here. I believe it's typically about ½ an inch, but this is based on human sizing and won't always work for dolls. The reason we make the back piece so much wider on people is the back of a human thigh tends to be fuller than the front, but dolls don't always follow those rules. So for all, to keep a slim fit through the thigh, I measure in from the extended point and mark the half knee measurement on the knee depth line. This gives me a pretty steep angle from the seat depth to the knee, but based on what I've done for this doll before, I think it'll be okay. Just in case, I also mark a dotted line using my totally less than precise eyeballing method. I'll probably cut the pattern there first, just so I can check and be sure that my plans haven't led me astray, because I do have a lot of dolls and I might be misremembering how pants fit this one. I'll finish the lower part of the leg in a moment, but first I'll hop up to finish the crotch since it's still in frame. I find where to mark the angled line on the back piece the same way as the front, measuring up the same distance as the crotch extension, then finding the middle point between those two spots. But unlike the front, I want a slightly deeper curve here because For All has a very round backside. For the back pieces, I usually want the curve to intersect this line at around halfway instead of 2/3, so I only mark my line out that far. It's a little off, but it doesn't need to be super precise because the pattern will still need to be tailored in the end. I freehand the curve up to the point I marked that's the same distance up as the crotch extension, then connect that point to the top corner of the waist, which completes the upper part of the back pattern. Now I can close up the last edge by connecting the crotch point to the extended knee point, and the knee point to the extended ankle point. Under normal circumstances, drafting for humans, you'd also pencil in placement for a dart on the waist. However, for a doll, I've never had that work, because the dart placement varies so much based on the scale of your doll and also the type of fabric you're using for the pants. So I typically leave it without a dart, and then tailor it to fit when I make my first mock-up, which is what becomes the final pattern. Being that I'm largely self-taught, I'm probably not the best person to teach pattern drafting, so I tend to shy away from it, but I also think it's really important to understand why human drafting rules won't always work for your dolls, which is why I tried to focus this video more on how I make the method work for me. From here, this base pattern can be customized further with things like pockets and openings, but I'll save that for another day. For now, take care, and I'll be back with awesome project updates in about a month. Thanks for watching. Bye.